Saturday, Venerable Samten and I attended a training with the Poor People's Campaign. So the Poor People's Campaign is a movement. The subtitle is a call for a national call for a moral revival. It's a multi-year movement, actually, of nonviolent action that is framed as a wish to change the conversation in our country about poverty, systemic racism, militarism, and ecological devastation, and how these themes are completely interconnected to have brought about the situation where we are today, which I learned a lot from going to this training as to what the situation is that we are in today. There's a lot anecdotally. You can look around, you hear, you read. There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering in the United States today. And this movement, the Poor People's Campaign, is seeking not, they're very emphatic and they have great slogans. It's not about Republican, Democrat. It's not about left and right. It's not about, but what it is about is right and wrong. And that being poor is not a sin, but poverty is a sin. So thinking in those kinds of terms, that's why it's being framed as a moral revival, a way of changing the whole conversation. And in changing the conversation, the idea is to lift up the whole society and to become a society that cares for one another, where that's our central goal, and not making more money or whatever else might be the driving force of our society as a whole today. So the Poor People's Campaign, I'm using the term resurrection. It's not theirs. It comes out of the ashes, or maybe, anyway, it comes out of a movement that Dr. Martin Luther King started over 50 years ago. Really towards the end of his life, after, the civil rights movement was beginning to have such a huge place on the American stage in the 1960s. Just a year before he died, he was speaking to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he said, "I think it's necessary for us to realize that we have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. In short, we have moved into an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society." And so Dr. King gathered 50 multiracial organizations to start the first Poor People's Campaign in March of 1968. Their goal, too, was to raise to change the conversation and to raise awareness about the relationship between racism, militarism, and poverty in the country. Now, a month later, just a few weeks later, actually, Dr. King was dead, assassinated. He had actually stopped to give a speech at a labor rights in Memphis on behalf of the sanitation workers that were on strike in Memphis to point up the relationship between racism and poverty there, right? But that's where he died. So the movement moved forward. That did go on for some time, but it lost its leadership, and in a way, I think it just lost its fuel. So now it's being resurrected by, particularly by a minister I've talked about him on the BBC's before. His name is Reverend Dr. William Barber. He's a former board member of the international NAACP, a position that he resigned in order to go ahead and lead this Poor People's Campaign. But he's also a minister, the Disciples of Christ, in North Carolina, where and North Carolina is a conservative state. But during his time as the president of the NAACP in North Carolina, he started to organize Moral Mondays, where on Monday every week, organizations, or a network of all kinds of organizations and people affected by regressive policies, marched on the state capitol. They did it over a period of 6 weeks. They brought forth all kinds of speakers, people living in poverty, people who were sick but didn't have any health care, North Carolina was the state that changed the bathroom laws about whether transgendered people can use the right bathroom or not. So those people also spoke. So there was like speaker after speaker after speaker, and acts of civil disobedience that led to arrests of some people. Their main focus was to try to move the legislature towards accepting health care for all people, or expanding Medicaid for the people in North Carolina, technically. Whether that happened or not, I don't know. But what did happen was a huge awareness and a change in the understanding of the people in North Carolina, to the point that the governor, who had had a 60% approval rating at the start of their 6-week campaign, his approval rating had dropped to 40% during that course of that 6 weeks, just by bringing people's awareness to it. So it's not like we're trying to change the popularity, but it's trying to make people understand what the issues are. So the Poor People's Campaign, as I said, it's a multi-year initiative. This is not something that just started and is going to end in June, but it is launched by a period of 40 days of actions in 37 states. It was launched on Mother's Day, and it will go through June 21, this beginning phase, where every Monday for 6 weeks in 37 state capitals around the country, there will be groups of people marching on the state capitol, bringing to their awareness different issues that are on the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign. So the first week was the issue of poverty. The second week, the issue of systemic racism. That was yesterday's march. Next week, the focus is on militarism in the war economy. Week 4 is on ecological devastation. Week 5 is generally about the rights to a living wage, right to housing, right to organize, rights to education, rights to childcare, that whole list of rights. And then the 6th week is like the culmination of joining together as a force in this nation. This is an unsettling force that has the capacity to bring this level of caring and responsibility to our national way of being. That's the goal, right? So in this training, we learned a lot. So among the things that we learned are that this particular whole movement is based on empirical evidence. They've done a mind-numbing survey called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America. It's on the Poor People's Campaign website. It's worth reading, but you can only read so long because there's so many statistics on so many areas. But there are a few things that, just to bring the point home for the need for this. Do you know that there are 140 million people in America today who are poor or low income? That's 43.5% of our population. Now, the federal government uses an index that shows a much lower number. Their index, however, according to that, the index that's used by the federal government is that the federal poverty line is an income of $11,880 for one person. Who can live on that? It's $24,300 for a household of 4. That's the line at the federal level, okay? So there's a new index called the Supplemental Poverty Measure that takes account income, but it also looks at the costs of housing, clothing, food, government programs, and runs an algorithm on that. And based on that number, 43.5% of our population. That's a lot of people. Did you know that 13.8 million U.S. households cannot afford water? The price of water has gone up so much in certain communities and people with low income that they cannot afford it. Furthermore, there have been issues with failing and aging infrastructure in the country. So utilities are now privatizing their water systems, which in general charge 59% more than the public water systems. So in the United States of America, people don't have water to drink. Did you know that we imprison and detain more people especially poor people, than any country in the world. 2/3 of these inmates are people of color. Did you know that we currently spend 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar on military, whereas 15 cents goes to anti-poverty programs? We spend more money on war than we spend on helping the people who live here. And the list is, I mean, just the fact sheet they gave us is a front and back list. I think I'll put it on the table up there. It's stunning figures. But the movement is not about the percentages. You know, that's a little bit numb. Their wish is to bring together the people who are most affected by these issues. They're trying to draw the line between, and this is Buddhist language, not their language, between the level of greed and the level of our national, our whole societal way of not looking at our spiritual values, but of looking at material values that have run our society for a very long time, and the devastating effect that it is having on the people who live in our country. To empower those very people to lead the movement and to make a big level of change. Dr. Barber, who's the minister that I mentioned, he says that in American history, as throughout the rest of the world, from abolition to women's suffrage to labor and civil rights, real social change has come when those most impacted by social justice have joined hands. They joined hands with allies, and they stand together to transform a better society. He said these movements did not simply stand against partisan enemies. They stood for the deep moral center of our constitutional values and faith traditions. Those deep wells sustained those who knew in their bones that power concedes nothing without a fight, and that in the end, love is the greatest power to sustain a fight for what is right. So the very principle of the Poor People's Campaign is also nonviolence. It's based on, again, what Gandhi's methods that were adopted for the civil rights movement, and it is there's a whole long contract or covenant, actually, that they ask of people who were involved to maintain the stance of nonviolence in a whole lot of different ways. So just the education of understanding what the Poor People's Campaign was about was very enlightening, illuminating for us. Also, during the training, there was a lot of, we had 2 role plays where we were allowed to, one, organize a protest in order to be able to stay calm, centered, and being able to willing to listen to any kind of heckling and whatever that might come from the outside, so that you can maintain this position of nonviolence. You can maintain a sense of dignity. So it doesn't become a shouting match. It doesn't become a brick-throwing match, but that people who are participating in these protests week after week after week are coming with the values of nonviolence as a part of their presentation. So that it was quite beautiful in that way. And I think I know that for Venerable Samten, I'm sorry she's not here to share, as a Canadian, you know, she was a little bit stunned by some of the history of this nation. You know, so much of our history has been, you know, drawn out of the racism that has been a part of our economy since the 1600s, right? And how that has affected everything that has come after it and continues to today. Also, so much violence has been a part, so much militarism, violence, not just violence in general, but military violence has been a part of our nation for so very long, and how that has affected us. One of the quotes I didn't pull, but that I find just stunning, in the current wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, all the ongoing wars that are going on here these days, the CEOs of the war companies, right, the corporations that are building and making money on those wars, the CEO salaries is roughly $14 million, whereas the top generals make $214,000 a year. So even the people fighting, even the people defending and whatever American values are, they're getting one thing, but then there's this whole corporate structure that's feeding for, getting paid from, and making a lot of money off the wars in America. And so all of these are interconnected. So from a Buddhist point of view, it's like, should a Buddhist be involved with this? But from a Buddhist point of view, I think there's a few points. One is we really are looking at the interconnectedness of how being raised in a society that is driven by our afflictions, and having lost the way of these basic human values that His Holiness talks about so much. The basic human values of kindness, caring for one another, of compassion for those in our society, for recognizing each other as brothers and sisters and being the same and wanting to be happy and having the equal right to be happy. The spiritual revolution that His Holiness has been calling for, I believe, is very much echoed in the language and in the activities of the Poor People's Campaign as it is being launched now. So I remember when Jan Willis was here, and one of her talks, I think it was a BBC talk, she was talking about, was Buddha an activist? Yes, he was. And is activism important in Buddhism today? From the Abbey point of view, yes, it is. Because our society, although the propensity for love and compassion is within us, the empathy is innate in our being, and yet so much of our social structures override that today. And it's not an idealistic, like pie-in-the-sky view that we can turn this around. That's something that I also was very inspired by at this training the other day. That they understand that they say years long, I'm sure generations long. Generations long. But as Dr. Barber says, we've got to hold up the banner until every person has health care. We've got to hold it up until every child is lifted in love. We've got to hold it up until every job is a living wage job, until every person in poverty has guaranteed subsistence. And the trainers told us that they had a meeting with James Lawson, who knows, maybe a relative of our monk here. He was the person that Dr. King, Martin Luther King, always attributed the whole architecture of the civil rights movement to. He, as a young man, went to India to study with Gandhi for 3 years. They say he came back with Gandhi's autobiography in one hand and the Bible in the other, and they sat down and laid out, based on these principles, this is how we're going to move the civil rights movement forward. So he's still alive, he's 89 years old. But he spoke to the trainers of this Poor People's Campaign just a few months ago. And what he said to them is, he said, never on the planet has there been a movement like you're trying to create today. The numbers of people involved and the fact that there is the technology that allows the communication between people in this country, so that 37 organized, all in the same theme, actions are happening here, and also the actions that are happening around the world of people moving towards recognizing the rights of all others to have happiness and the causes of happiness. So his view, his long-term 89-year-old view of the power of this movement, to me also is extremely inspiring. So I really recommend that people take a look at the Poor People's Campaign literature that I have here, what we'll put out, and that studying up on some of the realities of this country that we're living in, it will help us understand more deeply I think will help us understand a lot of things more deeply. I sure came to understand a lot of things more deeply. The kind of rhetoric that we hear today, the kind of political divisiveness that we hear today, the kind of suffering that people are experiencing, no longer, not just anecdotal anymore, but backed with, I mean, we can look in our neighborhoods and go, yeah, things are bad. We can look here in Ponderay County and see how many homeless teens there are, and we think, wow, this is really horrible. And so we take action. Or we can walk downtown Spokane and we can see all the homeless people and see how the shelters are trying to take care of those people. But we are not thinking about this is happening in Spokane, this is happening in Newport, this is happening in Idaho, this is happening in Oregon, this is happening in Nevada, this is happening in Michigan. This is, I mean, you start thinking about all the other places in the world, in this country, that it's happening, then the picture gets clearer. And that's worth taking action for. So as Buddhists, of course, we're looking at what are the causes? Well, everything arises dependent on other things, right? But so does change. It's not just an, oh, woe is me. We know that Buddhism gives us the potential for all kinds of transformation. And we have tremendous faith in the inherent goodness of each being. So on that basis of recognizing the kindness in one another, recognizing and developing our own compassion in that way, we can be a part of this campaign and rejoice in its activity. Okay, thank you.